Hello again to this new chapter of your channel Loke Habitas. In the previous video we talked a little about the opportunities found in the analysis of postgraduate studies in the construction, engineering, and architecture sector. Between studying locally at the universities of our city, in Latin America, or think a little about a university in the world, in Glossajon. There we reviewed 5 universities. I recommend them. In addition, we talked a little about the news in artificial intelligence, which, as always and every week, marks an important point. This week 2 important events took place. One is the release of advances about Apple and its new contributions to technology that incorporates artificial intelligence, especially the update of Siri. We will see in the coming days what it is about, and next year, there will surely be many more developments regarding the issue that has to do with the implementation of artificial intelligence across all Apple technologies. On the other hand, we also have great news that is truly a source of pride in Colombia because NuBank surpassed Banco Itaú's market cap, which shows that everything that has to do with the change in banking towards all digital products has a present and even a much more promising future. This contrasts very strongly, especially with the changes that occurred in mortgage banking, in all the history that we are going to see below. And it is important to highlight how these advances can positively impact access to such a precious good or family asset as the purchase of a home. We are going to take a look at this news a little later, and I invite you to listen carefully to the results of everything that has to do with the review or understanding of the history of suffering of a system like the UPAC. Let's see it. Many times the construction sector is criticized for being a bit unfriendly, so to speak, to changes or improvements. And I think that by reading the research a little you can find evidence that supports or contradicts that statement. We are going to see, for example, how in the case of the emergence of the OPAC system, the way in which housing projects are financed was changed in a period of a few years, and how people, the general public, found a financial vehicle to save and to be able to invest their resources through the banking system in the development of projects fundamentally. On this occasion, we are going to resume the conversation about research on how changes arise or, as we currently say, innovations in the housing financing sector. In a previous video, we talked about institutional changes and how a type of entrepreneur, which is properly called an institutional entrepreneur, can create changes in the systems that regulate a market. In some way, we reviewed how the system that took the name UPAC per unit of constant purchasing power emerged in my country, Colombia. This time we are going to go a little more into detail in a chronological line that I recommend you review until the end to find out all the details about this sector and how it can influence today. This story dates back to the year 1972, where a group of entrepreneurs managed to create the foundations for the operation of a system that would allow anyone's private resources to be channeled, that the banking system of that time would save, towards focusing them on the construction of housing projects. That, in a few words, was the system that lasted until the year 1999. Something similar existed in several Latin American countries. One of the people who saw that video asked me about how the story had happened in Bolivia, and reviewing a little, I find that the central bank had a support system for the development of projects until the year 1985 with significant state intervention. Surely in future videos we are going to delve into the history of each country in these terms, but for now we are going to focus on the history that compromises the Colombian financial sector. A financial system manages to emerge from new rules, and the rules have to be formalized. Normally, the parliaments or congresses of the countries are the organizations that allow these rules to be created. But beyond the official regulations, there must be a set, or as we would say today, an ecosystem of organizations that allows the system to function. In the case of UPAC, this group of organizations were mainly 10 savings and housing corporations that were created by decree at that time, at the beginning of the 70s, and took on names very familiar to Colombians such as Conavi, Granajora, Las Villas, etc. There were 10 housing savings corporations that took the name caps and were the pillars to make resources flow from private savings to the development of construction projects. That way, the structure that would allow this engine of development to function was being shaped. During all these years, there have been different changes in the regulations. More than 20 changes emerged. In the change of the formula that required the calculation of the UPAC. It was a calculation that was initially based on the variation in inflation, which depended on the salaries of the people who paid those mortgage loans. In the 90s, there was an important change, and the relationship was separated from the calculation formula that allowed valuing the variables known as interest rates. And it was supported much more by the average commercial interest rates charged by the banks. And that caused a change between the way wages grew and the growth of interest rates where they were established. Mortgage accounts for the payment of loans to obtain a house. These changes generated a somewhat superficial explanation in the 1990s. Which has given rise to investigations being highlighted, very detailed investigations being carried out to understand what happened, but in the end, the story falls on the actors who played, and there, which I have highly recommended. Reading the main actors, for example, in this case the director of the Central Bank of Colombia or the Bank of the Republic, who at the time was Miguel Urrutia, to understand the complexity of change in a system. So as not to remain with merely superficial matters, or we would say myths, that lead us to somewhat ambiguous or biased understandings about how a system decays. In the case of UPAC, that is the story. It is a complex story that is accompanied in the 90s by other crises parallel to that of the system itself. There is an outcome where there is intervention by the state, in this case the Constitutional Court of my country, Colombia, had to exercise its position to decree the operation of the OPAC system unconstitutional. Part of the story is explained by the decoupling of the interest rate. About the growth in income of the people who paid the dues, and I can't imagine how terrible, let's say, that situation was at the time. But on the other hand, understanding that part of history is complex, and I invite us not to stay only with the history of the decree of unconstitutionality of the UPAC, and think a little about what were the bases for making that decision, and I insist, about parallel crises that occurred at the end of the 21st century. And beyond that somewhat bittersweet story, think about how the entire construction system changed in order to survive these difficult years for the sector. How from UPAC we went to the UR, another system. And how we evolve a little in everything that has to do with reducing risks for the construction sector. How savings and housing corporations evolved, or merged with other banks. How is the banking sector currently involved in mortgage lending? How important are they today compared to the time? For someone who has lived through this story, there have surely been important changes. Went from being years ago, about 50 years ago, in a world where state intervention was present in the sector, through, for example, the Central Mortgage Bank. And how could banking become more sophisticated to allow thousands of people to acquire housing and save in what we call the opaque system? And how do we find ourselves today with a much more robust system? A construction sector better prepared for changes in economic cycles, or why not, be critical and evaluate the situation on, for example, why we have not been able to fill the housing deficit that we have in our countries in Latin America. What is the reason for this? Does the solution seem tireless? I invite you to see this topic on a future occasion. Share your concerns, your questions, and we will see you at a later time. See you soon.